This report covers Menachem Begin, the Israeli terrorist who became prime minister and won the Nobel Peace Prize. The featured picture of this report is of Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, standing with the US President Ronald Reagan in the south lawn of the White House. Despite being an MI5 designated terrorist and mass killer, Menachem Begin was never put under trial. Now I begin the report. In the late morning hours of July 22nd, 1946, a stolen truck pulled into the service entrance of King David Hotel in Palestine, in Jerusalem. It brought inside six terrorists. Two armed terrorists walked into the lobby and basement and herded the hotel staff into a kitchen. The other four terrorists carried in explosives laden in milk trucks to various support pillars that held up the six-story building, the King David Hotel. Confronted by a military officer of Britain and then the British military police, the terrorists shot and fought their way to a gateway park to a gateway car parked outside the French consulate a few blocks away. One of these terrorists was shot dead. Before the main bombing, a diversionary blast shook Jerusalem around the hotel, and roughly 51 minutes later, 51 minutes after the stolen truck pulled into the service entrance of King David Hotel, a massive blast covered the King David Hotel. It was bombed, killing 91 people and injuring 46 more. It was Menachem Begin and Irgun's, one of many terrorism acts in Palestine and abroad. The terror group of Mr. Menachem Begin, the Irgun Zawai Leumi, was designated as a terrorist group by British intelligence agencies, including the MI5. Irgun, as an organized group, would later evolve into the Likud party, the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel. What was King David Hotel? Back when it was mandatory Palestine, King David Hotel was the epicenter of political and social life for Europeans, Jewish, and Arabian elite. The basement nightclubs, La Regence, teamed with foreign dignitaries, celebrities, diplomats, and spies. Regional politics were shaped in the hotel's luxurious grand lobby, often with tea and biscuits. An attached picture shows an aerial view of Jerusalem showing the King David Hotel, which was the place of the main bombing, the YMCA charity building where the diversionary blast took place, and the French consulate from where the Zionist terrorists, made their escape. Upstairs, the King David Hotel housed the British Army headquarters on the fourth floor, the British Government Secretariat, various military and foreign intelligence services, and Britain's administrative services running the mandatory Palestine government. The mandate Palestine Government Secretariat ran from the hotel's first and top three floors in the south wing. As you can imagine, there was a constant flow of British military officers and government officers coming in and leaving to work and to dine. Despite being called a hotel, only a small section of two floors were open for civilian guests. King David Hotel was thus the beating heart of the Palestine Mandate and the British power controlling it. King David Hotel was widely considered the safest place in the entire Levant region, with barbed wires, constant MP patrols, gun pits, armored cars, and basically all other security measures. And anybody who was someone in either Palestine or Transjordan knew that politically you couldn't go higher than King David Hotel. It was the epicenter, the seat of power of the entire region. The attached picture shows the aftermath of Irgun's bombing of the King David Hotel, which killed 91 foreigners, including 41 Arabs, 28 Britons, 17 Jews, as well as two Armenians, a Russian, and an Egyptian, and a Greek national. Now, you would expect that the British response was very brutal. It would have been very effective. So, the short answer that I would like to give first is that Britain actually gave Menachem Begin, the terrorist behind this atrocious bombing, a clean chit, because he was a Zionist. And 60 years later of the fact, after the main bombing, only 10% of the British parliamentarians, only 10% of the British MPs denounced the terror attack. Now, for the long answer, the immediate British reaction to the bombing was brutal. Immediate Palestine police and the British Army brigades cordoned off access to Jerusalem and started a combing operation in a city that was already reeling with political and social crisis. But of course, the Zionist terrorists, the Irgun terrorists, had already escaped. Unlike the atrocities of the Islamic State or the Al Qaeda that are unequivocally wrong, absolutely wrong, Ergun's terrorism, Ergun's mass killing of civilians was apparently okay to the Western world. Zionist newspapers around the world started writing of some advance warning being given roughly 15 to 20 minutes before the main bombing, uh, a sort of a desperate measure to protect the brave Irgun terrorists. Now, what were these advance warnings? A series of more bombs were exploded in the building surrounded the King David Hotel. Like I mentioned, a bomb was exploded outside the YMCA charity building. A frantic phone call was made by a female terrorist accomplice to the reception of King David Hotel, warning them to vacate the building. Now, Israeli academics like Miss Anat Berko write on Muslim women who are involved in terror attacks, but she absolutely glosses over, but she absolutely skips over Zionist women who were involved in terror attacks on, of course, the British government and the local Muslim and Christian populations. This is a fact that was confirmed by British Field Marshal Lord Montgomery, who commanded all Britain's armies in the Middle East region. So the Zionists were actually defending Irgun's terrorism by saying that they, in fact, exploded more bombs. They actually did more terrorist acts in civilian areas. These insane mental gymnastics are continued even today and has become an official part of the Israeli government, an official stance of the Israeli government. A popular call is that the British Chief Secretary, Sir John Shaw, knowingly did not vacate the hotel because he wanted to defame the brave Irgun terrorists. Now we're making some massive leaps of logic here. The Zionists started a defamation campaign against Mr. Shaw, who clearly explained that no message had been received by any British officer in authority. As you can imagine, the reception staff of a hotel would not have any direct access to the top British military leadership that was in the King David Hotel. Mr. John Shaw also demanded to know the Western media narrative that basically considered the bombing of the King David Hotel, the killing of innocent civilians in the King David Hotel, was basically okay only because the Zionists were in charge of this terror attack. Mr. John Shaw and many other British officers who were in charge of managing the King David Hotel were personally targeted by Irgun terrorists. Mr. John Shaw was actually a victim of an assassination attempt at his posting in Trinidad and Tobago. Not even in Palestine, not even in the region of the King David Hotel, the Irgun terrorist parceled a mail bomb to him in a failed bid to assassinate him. Now, murder of foreign officers in foreign territories is a specialty of Zionist Israel, so more state-sponsored terrorism came as no surprise. We have examples of Mr. Ismail Haniyeh, who belonged to Palestine but was killed in Tehran, Iran in 2024. Mr. Qasim Soleimani, who was killed in Baghdad in 2020. Mohammad Raza Zahidi, who belonged to Iran and was actually killed in Syria in 2024. Mr. Imad Mughnieh, who hailed from Lebanon, who was killed in Syria by Israel in 2008. Mr. Khalil Ibrahim al Wazir, who belonged to Palestine, who was killed in Tunis in 1988. Mr. Mahmoud al Mabou, who belonged to Palestine but was assassinated in Dubai in 2010. Now, in 2006, when the world was actually reeling from the Second Lebanon War, the Zionists placed a commemorative plaque at the King David Hotel, celebrating the Zionist terrorism that had killed 91 people. The plaque stated, quote unquote. The hotel housed the British Mandate Secretariat as well as the army headquarters. On July 1946, airgun fighters, at the order of the Hebrew resistance movement, planted explosives in the basement. Warning phone calls had been made urging the hotel's occupants to leave immediately. For reasons known only to the British, the hotel was not evacuated, and after 25 minutes, the bomb exploded, and to Ergun's regret and dismay, 91 people were killed. Oh, the shamelessness on display. In the morning hours of 24 July 2006, the bill EDM 2624 was discussed in the British Parliament in Westminster to denounce Israel's plague in commemoration of the terror attack on the British government. Interestingly, only 64 MPs signed it in a House of 646 plus MPs. This essentially meant that only 10% of the British representatives of the British MPs denounced Israel's terror attacks on British mainland, on British territories. The bill that was tabled by Mr. Crispin Blunt from Rigate, who belonged to the Conservative Party, said, quote unquote, "We do not think that it is right for an act of terrorism which led to the loss of many lives to be commemorated." Now, so brazen was the Zionist projection of absolute power in the world that Menachem Begin, despite bombing the British army and government, was allowed to enter the UK in 1972. Now, can you imagine a Muslim terrorist being allowed to enter the UK? Menachem Begin faced no criminal trial for his terrorism, neither in King David Hotel bombing or in the Deir Yassin massacre, which would take place roughly 2 years, almost 2 years after this terror attack. Despite being classified as a terrorist by the MI5, which anyone must admit is an odd luxury. Now, who was Menachem Begin? Typical with all Israeli leaders, Menachem Begin was not actually born in Israel. He was not actually born in Palestinian territories. He was actually born in Belarusia. He was educated in Warsaw, Poland. Menachem Begin was a hardline Zionist with a long political and terrorism career that spanned the entire Palestinian territories. A skilled, charismatic orator, Menachem Begin rose to fame in Bitar, a Latvian Zionist youth organization. He was arrested for Zionist terrorism by the Soviet secret police, police, by the Russian intelligence, until his release was secured in the Polish-Soviet Sikorsky-Maysky agreement. Attached is a picture of Menachem Begin in captivity of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the NKVD, or as it is better known, the Soviet Secret Police. This picture is from 1940 when he was sentenced to 8 years in charges of Zionist dissent and terrorism. Now, after leaving the Polish army in 1941, Menachem Begin moved to Palestine and began organizing violent resistance to British control. In a bid to forcefully establish Israel as a sole state controlled by Zionists, he joined the Irgun, one of the three major Zionist terror groups that were operating in Palestine at that time, before the before the creation of Israel. Irgun, as a terror group, organized shootings, bombings, and mass killings across Palestine as a Zionist underground resistance to Imperial Britain. Now, the tale of Irgun's and Menachem Begin's terrorism, using only the definitions of Western intelligence agencies, Western law enforcement agencies, are far too many to contain in a single blog. So, Menachem Begin, however, rose through the ranks and quickly became Irgun's leader and mastermind. By 1948, 2 years after the King David Hotel bombing, Begin, after successfully executing the atrocious Deir Yassin massacre, started his political career after the British had left by creating his political party that he named Hirut. Now, that Hirut party today has changed its name to Likud and is the current party of Benjamin Netanyahu. Although Menachem Begin's early political career was spent on the opposition benches of the Israeli parliament, by 1977, Menachem Begin's party had won Israel's general election in a landslide, which handed him the prime ministership. That's right, his terrorism, bombings, and mass slayings were actually supported and voted by the Zionists of Israel. Now, in 1979, in recognition of his quote unquote peace efforts with Egypt, and the typical Western washing of Zionist terrorism, Menachem Begin was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which of course he shared with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. While the terms of this treaty are commendable, including the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Sinai Peninsula and the cessation of Egyptian blockade of trade vessels in the Strait of Tiran, the very idea of a terrorist being given the Nobel Peace Prize actually devalues the very idea, the very concept of it. Or maybe it doesn't. Or maybe we're all fooled into thinking that Nobel Peace Prizes meant anything at all. Have we forgotten that this Peace Prize was actually given to Obama, who bombed innocents for 8 years straight, but had the gall, the audacity to accept the Nobel Peace Prize? Now, the Airgun's bombing of the King David Hotel would go on to become the model for many terrorism acts to follow, which can basically be considered a hallmark Zionist contribution to the world. Now, this is not my word. This is actually mentioned in a book published by the Cambridge University in England from Professor Walter Enders from the University of Alabama and Professor Todd Sender from the University of Texas in Dallas. This book, titled The Political Economy of Terrorism, notes that Irgun's bombing of King David Hotel was so profound, it was so groundbreaking that the terror groups to follow in the coming decades would actually use this specific terror attack, this terror incident, this atrocity as a base, as a model to plan their entire attacks around. Maybe it's just one of the things. If you're a Zionist, international laws and anti-terrorism operations, they do not apply to you. A Zionist can bomb entire cities, mount armed resistance, and engage in mass terror slaughters and still receive standing ovations in the United States. Whether in 1978, as it happened to Menachem Begin when he addressed the US Congress, or in 2024, when the United States Congress stood up to give a standing applause 53 or 58 times to Benjamin Netanyahu for his atrocious, for his genocide in Palestine. Now, if you ask any Western source about who Irgun and Menachem Begin were, you'll be told that they were a military group, they were a paramilitary group, and a group of freedom fighters. Now, of course, as a concession, they will just sprinkle the word controversial as if that makes Irgun's or Zionist terrorism anyway acceptable. In this blatant hypocrisy, they often forget that by labeling Irgun as a paramilitary group, as a group of freedom fighters, Hamas would actually fall under the same category. Because, of course, Hamas is a paramilitary group, it's fighting for freedom. And then you'll be told to shut up and enjoy fish and chips because this is a rules based world. No better explained than by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Quote unquote, he says, have you ever seen these rules? No, because if no one has seen these rules, it means that those who talk about them can come up with these rules from a case to case in a way that suits their interests. In conclusion, I would like to add in a beautiful comparison that an early reviewer gave me. If there was some Muslim terrorist group involved in the bombing of King David Hotel rather than Irgun, rather than a Zionist terror group, Hollywood would have made entire thrillers on this event. They would have made entire documentaries, entire movies on this event. But because the terrorists were Zionists, the entire Western world will never, ever speak a word of this. My next post explores Menachem Begin's other terrorism acts, including the Deir Yassin massacre, where Irgun and other Zionist terror groups brutally slaughtered over 107 Palestinian villagers, including women and children. Now this 107 casualty figure is actually from Israeli sources, while the Arabian sources state that up to 1,000 people were brutally massacred on the streets. These are the sort of atrocities that make the like of Islamic State and Al Qaeda look like playground amateurs, like total noobs. Now stay tuned, subscribe to my email list, or follow me on Twitter. Thank you very much.